mean, for example, when people talk about existential risk, the generative AI, so things like ChatGPT, are not on a path towards any kind of existential risk. They're not even on a path to a successful product. And the issue here is not whether artificial intelligence can have value, but whether this particular approach, this particular generation will have value. And I think that it's entirely possible that what we're looking at is a scam.
Hello, everyone. This is your host, Manasa, and welcome to another episode of Tech Breakdown. For some months now, I've been speaking to several experts about the technological space we find ourselves in. And if you're new here, do go and check out some of the previous episodes. On this show, we operate on certain principles. We do not assume that all technology is cool. We believe technological tools have tendencies and that tech is certainly not neutral. And in today's episode, we are going to hit the pause button a bit and reflect on the story of how big tech became this giant force from the mid 2000s to now in 2023. What has happened? Where did we start? What happened along the way? And where does it leave us now? And we'll also look at more recent technological breakthroughs, artificial intelligence, and also consider how to think about AI as we reflect upon our approach towards big tech over the years. And who better to tell this story than someone who invested early in a social media company and then switched sides from a venture capitalist trying to help a young genius to now an activist warning about technological perils, Roger McNamee. Roger is a founding partner of the venture capital firm Elevation Partners, a former mentor to Mark Zuckerberg. He was an early investor in Facebook, but as he saw the growth and transformation of Facebook and the rise of other big tech companies, he started coming to terms with some of the damages it was doing to societies. He wrote a book called Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe, and now speaks very passionately about why and how tech companies should and can do better. He is also a musician and performs in the band Moon Alice. Welcome, Roger. Thank you so much for joining me on the show.
It is a great pleasure to be here today.
Let's first kick off. I think I first want to address sort of the big question that seems to be quite buzzing around in our space. And I think it's being touted as the next big thing, or rather already has been pushed as the big thing of our times, AI. And now when I say artificial intelligence, the recent buzz is, of course, around generative AI. In particular, but artificial intelligence as a field has existed for a while now. And in the most basic sense, it would, I guess, be a reference to building intelligent machines, right? And some would say machines that mimic some sort of thinking and behavior of humans, but basically computer code that solves problem and importantly, learns from itself and the data it is fed in a way that could also make predictions, what people would call machine learning. Would you say that is a good way of thinking about what artificial intelligence is, given how liberally the term is being thrown around? How would you define AI?
Yeah, I think the most important thing whenever you're looking at a new technology that comes to market is what is the intended purpose, who benefits, and who is harmed. The key thing I would suggest with what is called artificial intelligence today, which is more technically generative artificial intelligence. So it's this idea that you're going to take a mass of data, create a training set, and then use statistical processes to anticipate the next word or words given a prompt of a set of words. And so the way to think about this is it's not only not intelligent, it's based on a really flimsy idea, which is that you can create value by starting with a training set of essentially random content stolen from the internet. And that when people query that, they will get valuable answers. That's what they're trying to sell people on. What they're actually doing is creating a data set that sounds authoritative. The whole purpose of this thing is to make it conversational, to make it feel authentic, when in reality, the content it's based on is garbage. And Sorry, that's the legal part of it. Then there's all the stuff they've stolen. So there's an illegal component of it too. And to my mind, this whole thing is vastly overblown. I mean, for example, when people talk about existential risk, the generative AI, so things like ChatGPT, are not on a path towards any kind of existential risk. They're not even on a path to a successful product. And the issue here is not whether artificial intelligence can have value, but whether this particular approach, this particular generation will have value. And I think that it's entirely possible that what we're looking at is a scam. And what I mean by this is that the tech industry underwent a massive cultural change about 15 years ago. When the financial crisis hit in 2008, interest rates were driven to zero. And the people who were in the venture capital industry and the entrepreneurs out there had an insight that they no longer needed to make their customers more productive. That in fact, they could use data and free capital to exploit human weakness. And everything that's happened since the financial crisis in Silicon Valley has essentially been a version of that model. So if you think back to Spotify, which is one of the first companies out of that thing, it's all about exploiting the weakness of musicians. Then you had the gig economy, so Uber and Lyft and DoorDash and all of those companies that exploited the weakness of drivers or other gig economy workers. Then you had crypto, which was essentially bad computer science with a Ponzi scheme on top. Then self-driving cars, where they were trying to pretend like the artificial intelligence you could put into a car was good enough to avoid killing lots of pedestrians and lots of passengers. And then finally, we get to generative AI. And they all come from very common roots, which is they promise something that is not technically possible, and then raise gobs of money to try to speed it up. And meanwhile, they have a massive PR campaign, hype campaign, where the entire point of the campaign is to create the illusion that the technology is inevitable. Because if it's inevitable, then there's a huge benefit to people to adopting it early.
Just picking on that aspect about inevitability, right? A few months ago, what's called the Center for AI Safety released a statement. Well, calling it a statement is a bit of an exaggeration, really, because it was just a single sentence. And it was titled AI Extinction Statement. And the statement read, and I quote, mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside other societal scale risks such as pandemics and nuclear war. The funny thing about this statement, apart from how brief it is also that it was signed and released by the very tech companies and actors that were creating these generative AI tools like OpenAI and Google. And it is like they're saying we've come to warn you about something that we think is very dangerous and that probably should not be built. Oh, by the way, we are the ones building it. So I think it underlines that aspect of how they're trying to make it seem like there is something inevitable going to happen. Would you agree with that assessment? And what did you think of that statement?
The answer is it's total and utter horseshit, the statement. Everything about it is invented. It is a rhetorical trick. Look, tech companies have gotten really good at understanding human attention, right? Because companies like Facebook, like YouTube, were built on grabbing and holding human attention. So they know a lot about this. They understand the mind of journalists. They understand the minds of policymakers. And they have had a lot of practice at trying ways to manipulate those people. They're really good at it. And the AI guys, I think this hype campaign is one of the greatest marketing achievements I've ever seen. I mean, it's literally converting a sow's ear into a silk purse.
In terms of the statement, so you do think it was a distraction tactic?
Hang on, it's not a distraction tactic. It is completely part of creating the perception of inevitability. It was an escalation tactic in that campaign. And it was the one that was designed to make the thing blow out broadly. The week after that came out, I was speaking at a conference of Fortune 500 CEOs. And I want to say roughly half the people there who were polled, and I think they had 300 of the 500 there, and roughly half of them were actually worried about extinction risk. And I'm just sitting there going, have you guys not learned anything? What the hell is wrong with you? I mean,
why do you think this fear, or where this fear comes from? Do you think it is the statement and the fact that such a frenzy is being created, which is
well, what I realized afterwards is that for the Fortune 500 CEOs, their problem is that 5% interest rates or 5.5% interest rates, which is where we are in the US today, means money's relatively expensive. And the game they've played for 15 years is to borrow money at 0 to 1% interest rates and then buy billions of dollars of their own stock back every quarter in order to shrink the base and therefore cause the stock to go up. It's been an incredible campaign. And every Fortune 500 CEO basically has enriched themselves playing this game. And at 5.5% interest rates, that doesn't really work anymore. And Microsoft, very cynically but quite brilliantly, recognized that. And I think this whole campaign has been built around creating a sense of inevitability in the mind of CEOs so they would swarm to buy things that had AI in the name. And that's what's going on. And I don't see anything to stop it today. And every time somebody talks about existential risk, they're just missing the point. These products are intensely harmful today and have been from the beginning of time. Think back to the last generation of AI, what was called predictive AI. The three most prominent applications of predictive AI, I think in terms of dollars and impact, were predictive policing, mortgage review, and resume review. And in each case, we discovered something that was spectacularly depressing about our culture. And that is that the people who bought that software, police departments, banks, and HR departments, are actually really comfortable with bias. And what they wanted to do was to shift the bias from something they would be blamed for to a black box that wouldn't be blamed. So predictive policing has had the effect of over-policing Black and brown neighborhoods with enormously negative consequences. I think police departments are very comfortable with that. And now they have a black box to blame. Hey, the black box told me I had to police there. And the reason is because the training sets are based on all of the highly biased behavior of police departments in real life. Same thing in mortgages, right? In the United States, there's a thing called redlining, which is this notion that certain neighborhoods are for certain kinds of people and that other kinds of people are not allowed to buy a house in that neighborhood. And when you implement redlining in a black box, then nobody can be blamed for it. Same thing with resume reviews. Hey, we're not going to hire any women or any people of color or any old people. Well, the algorithm told us to do that, right? It's really convenient, but enormous harm because the affected people are either physically harmed with predictive policing or they lose opportunities with digital redlining and resume review. And this is the state of play. And when we put this in the context of politics, if you think about presidential elections or just the future of democracy, the thing that's wrong here is that we now have 7 years of evidence that the leaders of the tech industry value their own freedom of action and their own profits and their own opportunity more than they value democracy, more than they value civil rights, more than they value public health.
And I want to trace that thought about sort of anti-democratic tendencies and big tech. You, like I mentioned before, you were an early investor in Facebook and you're a former mentor to Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook's co-founder and CEO. You met Mark, I think, when he was 22 and yeah. Facebook was still quite young. And you thought at that point, I think, did you, that Facebook was a good idea and that you did find Mark to be really fascinating. But then at some point along the way, you changed camps. Can you tell us about what happened?
Sure.
Yeah.
So the critical thing about Facebook, when I met Mark, the company was 2 years old. There were 9 million users. They were all university and high school students in the United States. And what I imagined was that the opportunity was to create a community-based social network for English-speaking countries that wasn't just young people. It also included older people. And the reason I thought Mark was really interesting, and the reason why I thought Facebook was going to be the winner, was that in the early days, he required authenticated identity. And that I thought was a big deal, because one of the things we had learned in the early days of the web was that anonymity was the way that trolls got disproportionate power online. And that if everybody had to be their true self, you would eliminate one source of problems. I mean, there are obviously circumstances where people need to maintain privacy. In those days, I was not as worried about that as I am now. The second thing that Facebook gave you was control over who could see your data. It was a form of privacy. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, I think those two things are the foundational elements of a really great social network. So I thought Facebook was going to be the one. We came apart at the beginning of 2009. The company's up to, I think, 230 million or so users. And I'm explaining to Mark that, okay, I think now is the time to monetize. You've kind of gotten as far as you can get in the English-speaking world with people that you can reach with advertising. And Mark goes to me, no, I'm going for $1 billion. And I look at him, I go, Mark, there are only 7 billion people in the world, which is what there were then. I mean, do the math. There aren't 1 billion people that you can reach with advertising that are valuable. So if you're going for $1 billion, it means you're going to be doing business either under terms you shouldn't want to do or in places you shouldn't want to be. Don't do that. And he goes, dude, when I get to 1, I'm going to 2 billion. I go, Mark, that's nuts. Don't do that. Only bad stuff can happen. I said to him, look, it's pretty obvious that my ability to add value here has come to an end. Well, it was exactly the time when the culture of Silicon Valley was changing, but it was still 4 years before Mark figured out monetization, right? He didn't figure out growth hacking until 2013. And the key thing was the incorporation of data from outside Facebook, stuff he acquired from data brokers and from other websites, into their targeting. And that was a 2013 thing. So when I stopped working with him, I still did not imagine at all. And maybe this was a failure of imagination on my part, but I didn't imagine that it could go wrong.
In the start, did you not anticipate size problem, as in the fact that the bigger it would get at the point when you spoke to Mark then in 2009, I think you did mention that was worrying you. But the fact that he wanted to connect the whole world, was it because technically you thought that was not feasible in the same sense? Was it something that stopped you from worrying at that point, and then it was made possible?
This is a really, really, really good point you're making here. So prior to 2004, which is when Facebook was founded, it would have been completely uneconomic to try to make a global internet platform. Essentially, the industry had been limited for 50 years because there was never enough processing power or memory or storage or bandwidth to create something global. But all that, the predecessors to Amazon Web Services came to market around 2003. And that was because the restrictions on processing power, memory, and storage were evaporating. And so you could start to look at wired networks that were global. And Facebook and LinkedIn were the first two people doing that in the social world. And I, for one, did not fully imagine how that was going to develop. I mean, even though I was at Kleiner Perkins when they invested in Google, they never once talked about surveillance capitalism. I had no idea it was there until I met Shoshana Zuboff. And, shame on me for not seeing this, right? What I never saw in Mark in the early days was the notion that his vision, if it ever came into conflict with the values of a country he operated in, he would not adjust his vision to the culture of the places that he was in.
I think in a way, a lot changed, I guess, in terms of the systems that were in place, and a lot changed generally in the tech ecosystem that not only allowed, I guess, Facebook, but a lot of other social media companies to come in. And it is a totally different world now. And I wouldn't think anyone would predict it at that point.
The smartphone changed everything, because essentially after the iPhone, so 2007 introduction, 2009 though for the App Store and the thing we think of as smartphones today, that once you could watch a high definition video on a smartphone, which is roughly 2010, there were no limits. And from that point forward, it was really imperative that one of two things happen. Either governments set limits or that the companies regulate themselves. And of course, we got neither one.
Well, Facebook kind of claims it regulates itself with its oversight board, but it's a different story about
No. That's not, I mean, come on. The oversight board is an incredibly cynical PR move, and we shouldn't talk about it because it shouldn't be dignified with any respect at all. We shouldn't pretend like there's ever been an effort at self-regulation. Always and in every instance, it is about creating the illusion of compliance while continuing to do what they have always done. I mean, Zeynep Tufekci, the fantastic professor, sociology professor, wrote a piece a bunch of years ago about Mark Zuckerberg's then 14-year apology tour. I mean, Mark is a really smart guy, and he learned a long time ago that as a precocious, privileged white man, he could apologize for everything and always be forgiven, and then just go back to doing what he was doing. I mean, this is a company that signed a consent decree with the Federal Trade Commission in 2011 that said it would not share or sell user data without prior consent. That's a really meaningful consent decree. They ignored it, and there have been no consequences. Well, they paid a $5 billion fine, but that was mostly about protecting the privacy of Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg to keep them from having to give depositions. The FTC would have settled for a smaller number. So these guys have gotten away with everything. And our culture, at least in the United States, is very much about treating wealth as if it has a significance that borders on religious, right? I mean, we revere wealth, and we assume that wealth brings with it wisdom. And no amount of data to the contrary has persuaded us that that is not true. And the thing that really terrifies me about the 2024 election in the United States is that every internet platform has rolled back all of the election protections that and by the way, the election protections they put in place were hopelessly inadequate, but they rolled away even those. So there's nothing protecting us there. If you watch coverage of the 24 election in the United States today, there's no awareness in news media in the United States that we're dealing with essentially an ongoing coup, and that this is really about whether we're going to have an authoritarian form of government or a democratic form of government.
Going a bit to the point about elections, and I mean, your evolution in thinking about this also traces some sort of larger narrative around how big tech and social media is viewed. I mean, obviously, there is a sect of people who do think technology in general is cool, and somehow believe it's a neutral tool that you can assign responsibility to. But there is some shift in thinking around how social media was this great sort of democratic revolutionary force, and now it's become an out of control Frankenstein monster, right? And so now, as we approach elections, there are elections in the US, as you mentioned, in 2024, elections in India, so many different countries. What do we need to do on the big tech front? Because you did mention that some of the protections, little protections that were there, have been rolled back. So how do we make sure that our democratic institutions are not compromised?
I think this is entirely up to us as individuals. It is super clear that the tech industry has found a comfortable alignment with the powerful in every jurisdiction where they operate, right? In authoritarian ones, they do whatever the authoritarian wants. And in ones that were previously democratic, they're doing their best to bring more authoritarian voices into the conversation. So I don't think there's any hope for anything from a government perspective. And there's certainly no hope from a journalistic perspective, which means it's really up to all of us that we're going to have to educate ourselves.
I'm going to sort of derail it a bit and go to Twitter. I'm sure you probably read this, but there are reports that Twitter now wants everyone to pay to continue to use their platform. When Elon Musk took over Twitter, you'd given some interviews, and you'd basically said if we have Jazz Musk over Engineer Musk, implying that the side of Musk where he acts more impulsively, if that's what we got, it would be a great problem. We've now months into the takeover, and Twitter has gone through a lot of different changes. What are your views on what has happened to the platform, and also your views on the latest move, and what do you think it would do to Twitter?
So what have we learned since Musk took over? First thing we've learned is that it's possible to do enormous harm to a platform and still retain like 80% of your audience. That should scare us all, because Twitter is incredibly toxic. Fortunately, it's not that big, but politicians, celebrities, and journalists have, for the most part, remained on the platform. The platform no longer does the thing that made it unique, which is it was the meeting place, where it was the place where news met journalists, right? And it doesn't do that nearly as well as it used to. I think Musk is, a really sad person. And he's obviously got personal issues that, wind up affecting everybody because he doesn't seem to have much impulse control. That said, I don't view Twitter as our problem. I mean, Twitter is a problem, but even Facebook is not our problem anymore, or Instagram. I mean, they are part of our problem. But our problem is that we have, as a country, pretended like what's been going on since 2016 is normal, and that it doesn't require any kind of aggressive response.
Mm. I mean, final question. I think in terms of the story and evolution of big tech, would you say you've learned lessons from the rise of social media platforms, and that has taught you some important insights that we should pay attention to now that we are talking about AI? I mean, you do have do you think you have a more alarmist term about AI now, alarmist in the sense not about existential crisis, but about the immediate harms of AI than you probably had about, say, Facebook in 2006.
Well, to be clear, Facebook wasn't a threat in 2006, right? Facebook was a brilliant engineering design. I don't see anything about what's going on in artificial intelligence today that I would characterize as genius. What I perceive is a continuous process of iterating and trying to make things better, but combined with corner cutting in the pursuit of monopoly and billions, if you will, that guarantees that the products will not be great products. If they did the same thing that the people who are using predictive AI for gene sequencing or drug discovery did, which is highly curated training sets, which are incredibly expensive to create, then we wouldn't be having these conversations about generative AI, at least not in the same way. But, the problem here is the culture of tech changed. In the 43 years that I've been around there was a hard pivot, around 2008, 2009. Before that, the culture was really the intersection of the positive, optimistic values of the space program with the utopian visions of the hippies. And it was all about using technology to empower people. And that's what drove personal computing in the early days of the internet. People really were idealists. When the internet bubble burst in 2000, there was a void. And a couple things happened. Suddenly tech caught up. And so we finally had enough processing power, memory, storage, and bandwidth to make really big products. And once that shift took place and the risk came down, we didn't need venture capitalists anymore. And into that void stepped Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Reid Hoffman, and the other founders of PayPal. And they did not subscribe to Steve Jobs' vision of tech as a tool of empowerment, a bicycle for the mind. They were all about using technology to exploit human weakness. And, so when I look at the things that are going on now, these are just increasingly extreme versions of the same game.
I think I feel like I'm tracing all of these problems back to scale, even with big tech and with AI, in the sense that what you've outlined is when the scale of it was more local, it seemed to have at least some good results in certain cases. And as the scale has been expanded, be it with big tech, with surveillance capitalism, or with AI now trying to scope out all of this data and use it for more general purposes and not specifically tailored to a certain functionality like drug development, it's failing massively. So would you say scale is the problem?
Well, what I would say is it's the pursuit of global monopoly that is the problem. And again, that is an artifact of a time when you could raise capital at essentially no cost. Because it turns out these things aren't actually real businesses, right? I mean, when you look at it, if you force gig economy companies to pay people what they're worth, the business doesn't make any sense at all. Hell, it doesn't even make any sense when you're not paying them well, right? And if you run through each one of these, crypto's never going to make any sense. Self-driving cars. I mean, what is the point? We live in a time when the climate is on the verge of destroying life on the earth. All of our energy should be going to fixing that. And if we have any left over, we should be focused on education and healthcare. What is Silicon Valley doing? All of their effort is going into inventing problems they can solve. I cannot spot a use case of generative AI that works, that is valuable enough to pay more than a teeny fraction of the cost of development. I mean, you're not going to use it in search because what's the value of a search result that you have to fact check, right? By definition, search needs to be authoritative. And as you look around, the legal stuff doesn't work, the education stuff doesn't work. I mean, what's the high value thing? Now, corporations are going to buy a ton of this, and they're going to buy it because they want to lay off a lot of employees. And basically, because the world in the United States the economic world is monopolized, they have no fear of losing market share because they've made their product worse, right? And so I think that's a lot of what you see going on right now.
I think we should end there. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time, Roger. It was really insightful to talk to you, and your story also teaches us a lot. Thank you.
My pleasure.